He had enough medicine for one soldier. Two men were still breathing. Inside a canvas aid station near the Hurtgen Forest, late in 1944, a young American medic stared at the last usable dose in his kit. It was not enough for the room. It was not enough for the night. It was only enough to give one wounded man a better chance before the road opened again. On one cot, a soldier was shaking under a wool blanket. On the other, a second man had gone quiet in a way medics learned to fear. Both had tags around their necks. Both had names that would later be written by a clerk, folded into a report, and sent somewhere far from the forest. The medic was 24 years old. In this composite account, drawn from documented wartime medical conditions, his name is Thomas Avery. The name is fictional, but the pressure behind it was real. Men like him made choices that were rarely heroic in the way films remember war. They made them quickly. They made them quickly, and then they carried them for the rest of their lives.
I had enough for one man. There were two of them. I remember looking down at my hand and wishing it belonged to someone else.
Avery had not joined the army to decide who deserved another chance. He had joined as a medic, which meant he carried bandages, sulfa powder, morphine syrettes, plasma supplies, scissors, tape, and a notebook already stained from too many hands. His job was to run toward the wounded when everyone else had to keep firing. Before the war, he had worked in a drugstore in Pennsylvania. He knew the smell of alcohol, iodine, paper labels, and clean shelves. Medicine, back then, had seemed like something orderly. A dose had a label. A bottle had a purpose. A name on a prescription matched the person waiting at the counter. The war changed that. In the forest, medicine became something counted in darkness. It was what remained after the last truck failed to arrive. It was what a medic felt for with cold fingers while artillery shook dirt loose from the tent roof. It was the difference between doing something and standing beside a man with nothing left to give. The aid station was not a hospital. It was a low tent and a dugout beside a damaged road, hidden behind trees that had been stripped by shell fire. Blankets hung over the entrance to keep light from leaking out. Crates served as tables. A lantern swung from a wooden support whenever the ground trembled. Outside, the forest was full of noise without shape. Artillery landed somewhere beyond the road. Machine guns opened and stopped. Men shouted for stretcher bearers through the trees, but the sound arrived broken by wind, distance, and fear. The wounded came in with mud on their boots and pine needles in their clothing. Some still spoke clearly. Some asked about friends. Some asked whether the wound looked bad, even when they already knew. Others only stared upward, as if the canvas above them had become the only safe thing in the world. Avery moved from cot to cot with the tired efficiency of someone trying not to think too deeply. He checked bleeding, breathing, pulse, and shock. He wrote what he could on tags. He marked who could wait, who needed transport, and who might not live long enough for either. In training, triage had sounded like discipline. A medic sorted the wounded by urgency, chance, and available help. Treat the man who could still be saved. Do not spend the last supply where it cannot change the result. Keep moving, because the next stretcher may carry the man you can still pull back. It was a hard rule, but it sounded almost clean in a classroom. Inside the aid station, nothing was clean.
Nobody tells you what mercy costs until it sits in your palm. Training gives you steps. It does not give you peace.
By midnight, the road behind the aid station was under intermittent shell fire. The jeep that was supposed to carry men back had not returned. The doctor had been called forward to another group of wounded near the line. A sergeant came in twice asking for supplies, and both times Avery watched his face fall when he saw the satchel. The supplies no longer matched the number of bodies in the room. There were bandages, but not enough. Sulfa, but not enough. Morphine almost gone. Plasma nearly gone. The little things that made medicine feel possible were disappearing one by one. The last dose Avery could still use safely was set aside on the crate. It was small enough to hide in his hand. That made it worse. Something so small should not have been able to decide so much. The first wounded man had arrived conscious and in terrible pain. He was older than Avery, maybe 30, with the hard face of someone who had already survived more than one bad winter. A fragment had torn into him badly, and every breath seemed to cost him. He kept his eyes open, not because he was strong, but because pain would not let him go. The second man came in a few minutes later. He was younger, pale, and almost silent. His wound looked less violent at first glance, but Avery did not trust first glances anymore. The boy's pulse was weak. His skin was cold. He did not call out, and that frightened Avery more than shouting would have. The loud man pulled attention toward him. The quiet man was slipping away. Avery checked both men again. He measured what could be measured and guessed at everything else. He pressed fingers against a wrist, watched the chest rise, checked the bandage, looked at the face, then looked at the satchel. The room seemed to narrow around the crate. He did not need anyone to ask the question aloud. The older soldier needed relief immediately. The younger one needed a chance to survive transport. The last dose could not do both. If Avery used it on the man in the worst pain, he might ease suffering without changing the end. If he used it on the younger man, there was a narrow chance the next evacuation would matter. A narrow chance was still a chance. That was the arithmetic of the aid station. That was also the cruelty of it.
I wrote one name down. I still remember the other. That is the part of the war that never left the tent.
Avery tried to delay the choice by doing everything else first. He tightened a bandage that was already tight. He checked the entrance for the doctor. He asked a stretcher bearer how long until the road opened, though he knew the man had no answer. He moved a lantern closer, then farther away, as if better light could create another option. Every small task gave him a few more seconds. None gave him another dose. The older soldier watched him. Avery never forgot that. The man's eyes moved from Avery's hand to the younger soldier and back again. He understood more than Avery wanted him to understand. There are moments in war when speech becomes unnecessary. Men read the room. They read hands, faces, silence, and hesitation. The older soldier read all of it from the cot. Avery looked toward the tent entrance once more. No doctor came in. No jeep arrived. No orderly appeared with a fresh box from the rear. Only another wounded man was carried past the opening, then turned away because there was no place left inside. The decision had waited as long as it could. Avery gave the dose to the younger soldier. There was no speech before he did it. No promise. No sentence that made the decision cleaner. He leaned over the cot, steadied his hand, and did what his training told him offered the best chance of saving a life. Then he turned back to the older man. That was the part memory kept sharpening. Not the shelling, not the cold, not even the sight of the dose leaving his hand. It was the turn back. The satchel still looked like a medic's satchel from the outside. It still had straps, pockets, and weight. But the thing Avery needed was gone. He had to return to a man who knew it. He stayed beside the older soldier longer than he should have. Other wounded men were waiting, and a medic could not belong to one cot for long. Still, Avery adjusted the blanket, checked the dressing, and kept his voice steady. He did not tell the man everything would be all right. He had heard that lie too many times. Instead, he told him he was not alone. It was less than the man needed. It was all Avery had left. The shelling eased sometime before dawn, but the silence after it was not peaceful. It was only the kind of silence that made everyone listen harder. Men outside moved quickly because the road might close again. The evacuation jeep finally returned with a driver whose face was gray from exhaustion. The younger soldier was still alive. Barely, but alive. Two men lifted him from the cot and carried him toward the road. Avery watched the stretcher pass through the tent flap, then forced himself back to the next man. He did not allow himself to follow it with his eyes for long. Hope, in that room, was dangerous if it made the hands slow. The older soldier did not leave with that jeep. By morning, the aid station had changed shape again. Fresh wounded had replaced the men moved out. Empty wrappers, torn bandages, and used dressings covered the crate beside Avery's satchel. A clerk collected tags, corrected spellings, and asked for names Avery did not want to repeat. Reports later made the night look orderly. Number admitted. Number evacuated. Number died of wounds. Number returned to duty. Paper needed categories because armies could not run on memory. But Avery did not remember categories. He remembered the cot nearest the entrance. He remembered the boy whose breathing almost disappeared. He remembered the older man's eyes. He remembered the feeling of an empty hand. The younger soldier survived long enough to reach a field hospital farther back. After that, the record becomes harder to follow, as it often did. A man could survive the aid station and still lose a limb. He could survive surgery and never return to the line. He could survive the war and spend years inside a body that never fully came home. Survival was not a simple word. The older soldier's name stayed with Avery longer than the paperwork did. Not because Avery knew he had chosen wrongly. That was the cruelty of it. He may have chosen exactly as a medic was supposed to choose. He may have saved the man with the better chance. He may have done the most useful thing possible with the least mercy available. The weight remained anyway. That is the part people outside the aid station often misunderstand. They imagine guilt belongs only to mistakes. Combat medics knew better. Sometimes guilt followed the decision that saved the most life. Sometimes it followed the choice no better man could have avoided. Avery kept serving after that night. The war did not pause for what happened inside him. He treated burns, frostbite, shock, infection, shrapnel wounds, broken hands, and fear disguised as anger. He learned to sleep sitting up. He learned to wake at the sound of boots stopping beside him. He learned that wounded men often apologized to medics. They apologized for bleeding on their coats. They apologized for crying out. They apologized for taking time for men who looked worse. Avery hated those apologies more than almost anything else, because they made the men sound as if pain were a failure. The line moved. New roads opened. Old aid stations were abandoned. The forest swallowed shell holes, helmets, torn cloth, and pieces of equipment no one had time to retrieve. Maps changed. Units shifted. The war kept converting suffering into paperwork. Avery's satchel kept getting refilled. That did not make it feel full again. There were other nights after that one. Other choices. Other men. Some he reached in time. Some he did not. A medic's memory does not arrange itself like a campaign map. It stores faces, hands, voices, and unfinished sentences. It stores the weight of a body on a stretcher. It stores the moment when a man stops asking questions. Years later, Avery could describe parts of the forest clearly. He could remember the smell of wet canvas and cold mud. He could remember how the lantern light made everyone look older. He could remember the thin sound of metal instruments in a crate. But when asked about courage, he rarely spoke about charging forward. He spoke about staying. Staying beside a man when there was nothing left to give. Staying calm enough to choose when every choice was cruel. Staying useful after the decision had already damaged something inside him. World War II is often remembered through numbers large enough to become distant. Divisions, armies, casualties, miles, tonnage, dates, and maps. Those numbers matter. They explain scale, movement, and consequence, but they do not explain what it felt like when history narrowed to one medic's hand. Avery did not decide the battle. He did not capture a town or change a campaign. No monument was built for the moment inside that aid station. Yet for the two men on those cots, his decision was the center of the war. That is why stories like this remain important. They remind us that courage was not always loud. Sometimes it looked like a young medic opening a satchel and finding almost nothing left. Sometimes it meant choosing quickly, then living slowly with the memory. Sometimes the hardest battlefield was the space between two wounded men. The dose was gone in seconds. The decision stayed for decades. And in the end, that may be the most honest way to understand what happened inside that tent. Not as a story about one perfect choice or one cruel mistake, but as a story about the kind of burden war gives to ordinary men. They were not generals. They were not writing strategy. They were young soldiers with shaking hands, small medical kits, and too many names to remember. On that night near the forest, Thomas Avery had one dose left. Two men were still breathing. And for the rest of his life, he carried both of them.